short story with a conflict as old as time. The interpreter of Melodies tells a tale of infidelity, trifling wenches, and failed marriages. With sickening revelations and a gripping climax, the story cements itself as an instant classic. We start off with the Das family, Mr. Das, Mrs. Das, Tina, Bobby, and Ronnie. They're in India on vacation and wish to see the Sun Temple, so they hire a guide, Mr. Kapasi. From the start, Mr. Das shows that he has little control over his family as his children hardly listen to him and his wife has little respect for him. This will set the stage for the rest of the story. They get in Mr. Kapasi's car and the family is on their way to the Sun Temple, and Mrs. Das starts it off by bickering with Mr. Das over the lack of AC in the car. It's apparent she's uninterested in her family, but what highlights this behavior is her sudden interest in Kapasi. He tells them of his job in a doctor's office, where he works as an interpreter for patients who are unable to communicate with the doctor. Mrs. Das reacts to this information by calling it romantic, and it's the first real display of interest she shows in the story up to this point. For Kapasi, this display is almost intoxicating, because his wife treats him in a similar manner, so the supposed act of affection catches him off guard. For the majority of the story, this will cause Kapasi to start daydreaming about Mrs. Das as he plays scenarios with her in his head. They stop for lunch, and usually, Kapasi goes on his own, but this time, Mrs. Das insists he sits with them. They take a picture together, and Mrs. Das asks Kapasi for his address so she can send him the picture. This adds more fuel to his fantasies as they begin to progress to the point where he imagines them writing to each other about their home countries and rocky marriages. They eventually make their way to the Sun Temple. Kapasi, who at this point is extremely infatuated with Mrs. Das, finds himself admiring her legs. This causes him to further think about his marriage and how much he despises it. When they're done, Kapasi can hardly stand saying goodbye, so he recommends they visit a nearby monastery. The kids want to, so Mr. and Mrs. Das agree to go, and they make the journey there. They arrive at the monastery, where they find it crawling with monkeys, but Mr. Kapasi tells them not to worry. The family goes to explore, but Mrs. Das stays behind and asks Mr. Kapasi to do so as well. When the family is gone, she reveals to Mr. Kapasi that she had an affair with one of Mr. Das's friends, and that Bobby is not Mr. Das's child. She hopes Mr. Kapasi can help in some way, but he is unable to, and she storms off. She leaves a trail of food, and as a result, the monkeys grow restless. Because of this, they attack Bobby, and Mr. Kapasi is forced to run in and save him. Damn. The paper with his address flies out during the exchange, and only he notices, but he does not care at this point because he is off-put by Mrs. Das's behavior.
The setting takes place with the Das family going on vacation in India. They carry an Indian background, but neither of them are from India. The vacation gives them a chance to learn about the culture and its history. They visit the Sun Temple and learn about its history and meaning. Mr. Kapasi then decides they should go see the hills at Udagiri and Kanadagiri. The only reason he suggests this, though, is so he can spend time with Mrs. Das.
Characters. The Das family is all very young. The parents haven't hit 30, but have 3 averagely young children. They are of Indian descent, but have been raised in the U.S. Meena and Raj married young due to the relationship between their families. Meena has fallen out of love with her monotonous life. She has no one other than Raj, who doesn't pay any attention to her. She longs for attention from anywhere else, hence the affair with a friend. Raj does not know about the affair and that Bobby isn't his son. Mr. Das is naive enough to think Mrs. Das is still in love with him. Meena's indifference extends to her children. She doesn't love them as much as one should love her own kids. Not to say she dislikes them, she just doesn't possess interests most mothers have with their children. To her, the children are a part of her miserable life. The lack of communication between all of them creates an unfulfilling environment. Tina expresses her desire for her mother's attention. Ronnie exhibits traits of his father, while Bobby does not resemble Raj in any way. Mr. Kapasi finds a fascination with Mrs. Das. He feels they are one and the same, both stuck in loveless marriages that suffocate their hopes and dreams. He likes the way Mrs. Das finds him interesting and his job romantic. His crush soon fades when he learns of Mrs. Das' perspective of their relationship.
In Interpreter of Melodies, the most important symbol is a note Mr. Capacci gave to Mrs. Das. When Mrs. Das took a picture with Mr. Capacci, she wanted to send him the picture through the mail, so Mr. Capacci gave her his address. This excited Mr. Capacci as he was having fantasies of divorcing his unloving wife and potentially marrying the more interesting Mrs. Das. After Mr. Capacci learns of Mrs. Das' secret affair, he is appalled not only that she was using him to ask for help, but that she was an adulterer. When Mrs. Das saved her bastard son from the attacking monkeys, and the slip of paper with Mr. Capacci's address on it fluttered away in the wind, Mr. Capacci showed little to no regret, showing him moving on from Mrs. Das. Mrs. Das tends to dissociate from her family, showing little concern for her young children and husband. She seemed to hide behind her glasses, referred to as a tiara, as a way of making herself royal or untouchable by common people, her family. Mrs. Das never interacted with anyone until she lifted her pinkish-brown sunglasses and arranged them on top of her head like a tiara, and started talking to Mr. Capacci. When he announced he was an interpreter, this reminded her of her affair and hoped he could interpret what it meant and interpret for her what to do. This affair consumed Mrs. Das in her every thought, and she didn't break her facade until she saw the potential escape.
The theme of the story is the lack of communication hinders the ability to build meaningful connections with others. Mr. and Mrs. Dawson's inability to communicate with each other creates a hostile environment for everyone around them. They are trapped in an unhappy relationship because they cannot speak to one another about their deeper problems. Mrs. Dawes seeks attention from anywhere outside of her family. She tries to build a connection with the interpreter that guides them around India and ends up confessing her adultery to him. She confesses that she has a child with the other man. The parents struggle to communicate, rubs off on their children, allowing them to be disrespectful to them. Everyone in the family is stuck in their own lonely world trying to reach someone.
Jhumpa Lahiri was born in London in 1967 to Bengali parents. The Bengali people are Indo-Aryan people from the Bengal region, which covers a part of the eastern Indian subcontinent. She grew up in Rhode Island, but would make frequent trips to India, so both places shaped her as she grew up, later influencing her writing. She started writing as a young child and eventually landed a spot in the creative writing program at Boston University. Afterward, she went on to obtain her PhD, but this led her to conclude that she was not meant to become a scholar. After obtaining an agent, she was able to publish her first story in the New Yorker and kickstart her career. She has described the characters she is drawn to as those who face some sort of barrier in their communication with others. In The Interpreter of Melodies, we see that there are characters that quite literally cannot communicate due to language barriers, but more importantly, there are those who are unable to communicate their emotions and end up recklessly damaging their relationships with others.
Most of Jhumpa Lahiri's stories revolve around a character who struggles to communicate. Lahiri struggled to find her voice after years of trying to write and then attending a PhD program. After deciding academia was not for her, Lahiri found an agent and started publishing books. She describes her favorite characters as those who struggle to communicate as well. Lahiri's personal connection to characters who struggle to communicate presents itself in The Interpreter of Melodies as a guilt-ridden adulterer. Mrs. Das's affair consumes her, and she can't find an outlet. After telling Mr. Capacci about her affair and how she is tired of feeling so terrible all the time, she asks him to suggest some kind of remedy. Mrs. Das feels surrounded by the guilt of her affair when she has to see her family every day. This guilt makes her turn a cold shoulder to them and lose love for them. She refuses to talk about what she has done, even though she can't stand to look at her family a moment longer, making her lose any sense of purpose and love for life itself. Lahiri never experienced anything this severe, but she still struggled to express herself at first and find her true passion. Her love for writing about characters such as Mrs. Das stems from her own struggles to express herself through writing and not academia. Jhumpa Lahiri's personal experience visiting India shows in her depiction of the culture and setting. From the vast jungles to the rundown roads, the Das family goes on a truly immersive experience. Without Jhumpa Lahiri's knowledge, the setting would have fallen flat. Details like the type of monkeys hanging around in the trees and how they are more hungry than dangerous fully immerse the reader with an understanding of the atmosphere.